Welcome to the Free Speak Podcast.
Hello there. My name's Graham Hopwood. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research in Namibia, but also I've been a journalist for a number of years and worked alongside Gwen Lister, who I'm going to speak to in a moment, for about 12 years, I think. And Gwen has recently published her autobiography called Comrade Editor. I'm going to talk to her, unfortunately, via phone because of the difficult COVID situation in Namibia at the moment, about the book and about what inspired her and the key historical aspects of the book as well. Hi, Gwen. It's about 2 weeks since Comrade Editor, your autobiography, was published and released, and you've been doing quite a bit of media work and online work since then. How has the reaction been so far, and what are people saying about the book?
Well, Graham, so far, not that much reaction has come in. There have been a couple of comments from people who've read it. I haven't noticed if there have been any reviews done here or in South Africa or anywhere else. But I do know that Murray Levita of the Burger newspaper in South Africa did a fairly extensive interview with me and got some fairly negative comments back from the old sort of Afrikaner establishment, which is probably no surprise, saying that I had kind of done what I'd done for reward and so on. Clearly they haven't read the book, because then they would see that in fact I was offered reward, if that's the right word, but turned it down. So far I think a lot more reaction still has to come in as people get access to and read the book.
It's interesting that, that old white establishment that goes back 30, 40, 50 years is still around and reacting, because that leads me on to my first question, which is, you were born in South Africa and spent your early years there. And I mean, in a time when very few white people aligned themselves with the struggle against apartheid and against colonialism. And I guess reading the book that you're upbringing wasn't too different from many white families in South Africa at the time. So I wondered, what were the key turning points that you cover in the book in terms of what made you aware of apartheid and decide to become an activist rather than a bystander, as many whites were in South Africa, people who probably realized apartheid was wrong but didn't do anything about it. And the others, of course, who were actively involved in supporting the apartheid system. What were the turning points for you?
Graham, it's a good question and it's something, I've dug really deep about in the writing of this book and in my life in general, actually. And it's very difficult to establish exactly when I became aware of apartheid and how really shocking it was. But I know it was at a fairly young age that I became conscious of it. I do mention in the book a couple of incidents, walking as a young child with my mother and seeing, elderly black people have to kind of step off the pavement into the road as sort of obnoxious whites walked straight into them. So that consciousness, I think, was born very early on. And then also a number of seminal moments, I think, in my teens. I also cite the example of buses in those days, public transport, which was segregated, and having to get on a bus as a young white scholar and sit down at the bottom of the bus and seeing an elderly black lady get on and then couldn't make it up the steps to the top section of the bus. And so I gave her my seat, and the whole white group in the bus itself erupted in anger at what I'd done. So there were a number of moments like that. My daughter called it my aha moment, that really galvanized me into thinking, whatever I do in life, it has to be something that will try and change this horrible system that we're living under.
I think one of the key features of the book for me is the way that you describe and go into detail about various key personalities who were around before independence in particular. I mean, obviously one dominant figure in various parts of the book is Smitty, or Hannes Smit, the former editor of the Windhoek Advertiser and the Windhoek Observer. But one other figure who features at various points, and probably the most significant personality in recent or modern Namibian history is Sam Nujoma. He's obviously still alive, and he's now 92, but having been out of power for more than 15 years. I just wondered, as a character in the book, and as somebody who later became quite critical of the Namibian and actually in some ways took actions to undermine it when post-independence, how do you view Nujoma now? And what were his best attributes, but also what were his weaknesses?
Right. I think, as you rightly point out, like Smitty, who was an editor I worked with in my early days in journalism and for quite a number of years thereafter, the sort of highs and the lows of working with Smitty. Equally speaking, I think it's true to say that Sam Nujoma loomed large in my life. Prior to independence, as you probably know, like Smitty, he loomed large in my life. As a young journalist, I quickly earned his trust. I think because of my progressive reporting on the liberation movement and what was happening in Namibia, and I think he saw very clearly that I was a person who really believed in change as far as apartheid and, of course, the domination of then Southwest Africa was concerned by the apartheid authorities. So that was a good relationship. And then, of course, as you mentioned, post-independence, there was quite a bit of fallout when the Namibian, which stuck to its sort of independent stance post-1985 when it started, and especially after independence, started to hold the SWAPO government to account. And this was not perceived in a very positive light by, among others, Nujoma. We criticized him on a number of aspects, from human rights regarding gay rights, for example. We also criticized the incursion into the Congo to prop up Laurent Kabila. There were a number of issues where we kind of held the government to account. And slowly but surely, Nujoma turned against us, and that, of course, culminated in 2001 in the sort of ban of the Namibian, if that's the right word, where government decided not to advertise in the paper, neither would they purchase copies. And then, of course, after that, there was a period of a couple of decades where Nujoma and I were really estranged from each other. But in some ways, I think it was a kind of rapprochement, and again, I deal with that in the book, when earlier this year, when he was diagnosed with COVID and was in Medicity in Windhoek, that President Hage Geingob actually asked me to accompany him to see the founding president, and, we shared a couple of laughs, and in a way, I think it was really nice to be able to bring things to a close. Not a complete getting together. I suspect we'd always differ on a number of crucial issues, but at the same time, I think, in a sense, it was good for me and good for him that we actually had that meeting eventually.
The book, is in a way, is an account of the internal struggle, in Namibia against apartheid and the South African occupation, and in some ways, obviously, that story of the internal struggle has been overlooked. And when there is a focus on recent Namibia history, it's often on the exile, the people who were in exile and what happened in exile, although, of course, there are areas there, such as the detainees saga, that haven't properly ever been accounted for. But, in general, who are the other sort of key people, particularly before independence, who actually were quite significant historically, but maybe have been overlooked and forgotten? But you do feature quite a number of them in the book.
Yeah, and Graham, it's an important question as well, and one, unfortunately, you make mention of that sort of tension, if you like, between internal and external SWAPO, which was very palpable in those days in many ways. But unfortunately, and I must chip in here and say that you were one of the very few people to have read the unexpurgated version of this book, because, as you know, it was edited down by almost half at the end, and there was a lot more detail on this particular issue that unfortunately had to go out. Hopefully, though, it'll give me opportunity to follow up if I still have another book in me going forward. But yes, there were I think, many unsung heroes and heroines of the Namibian struggle, and many of them were ordinary people. But naming names, I think of people like Victor Nkandi, who, of course, received the death penalty. He kind of disappeared. There's nothing said about him these days, and even the Shifidis, Emmanuel Shifidi, who was killed on a dusty field in Katatura by the South African security forces. People like them seem to be unlauded in Namibian history. And so I do hope, I couldn't go into that much detail in this book because, of course, there are three clear strands, which is my own personal sort of life story, as well as the story of journalism and, of course, the birth of our nation. But I'm hoping that a lot of those people that I've mentioned will find their rightful place in history going forward.
Yes, you mentioned the earlier version of the book, which I saw and read, which I think was probably about twice as long as the published version.
Absolutely.
And it is a real shame that publishers these days don't seem to think that readers can handle longer books, but hopefully you will have a chance to bring out some of those aspects in other ways, either articles or a book in the future. But I just wanted to go back to the founding of the Namibian in 1985, and which itself was a struggle, and you had to react to the end of the Windhoek Observer in terms of your role there. And then, of course, the Namibian, particularly in the 5 years up to independence and just after, actually, went through a number of traumatic episodes, including fire bombings, your imprisonment and the harassment and intimidation of yourself, but also others working for the newspaper as well. Obviously, I'm presuming that took a personal toll. And, these days we hear a lot about young people complaining about anxiety and, issues that they do face, trauma, which, are real. But I just wondered, how you and the newspaper got through that period, and also, where you found the resilience, which is something I think we all need at the moment, particularly in light of COVID, to really be able to not just survive, but to be able to do what you needed to do in terms of the newspaper's role.
Absolutely, Graham. And, it was interesting that I think it was a South African interviewer who actually asked me recently, referring to exactly what you're talking about, did I ever have any kind of therapy? And my answer was no, I never have had any. Whether, obviously, I think these historic issues and problems and obstacles and harassment and all that there was at the time do have their effect. And I think just shortly after I finished writing the book, and also, funnily enough, the day it was published, I had a kind of meltdown. And I think that was kind of a delayed PTSD after all those years, because there have been so many decades, and especially, obviously, in the 70s and the 80s, when times were really tough. So I think, yes, myself and many other staff members, especially the brave, group who started the paper with me, I think we've had to dig deep. And as to your question as to how one sort of continued, why we did it, were there moments, of course, that we thought, what the heck are we doing, is absolutely true. But I don't know whether I'm just unordinarily stubborn but it was always a case of one obstacle after another. And I always use the analogy of when I was a kid with the parents at the beach as a very young child, and I'd sort of stand on the edge of the waves, and a wave, probably a fairly little one because I was small, would come and sort of knock me over, and I'd get up spluttering with sand in all orifices, and that would happen time and again, and I think I'm going to be able to swim one day. And I think that's kind of the way I approached what was happening in those days, that I thought I can't be defeated. I can't let fear kind of be the end of me. And so it was really a case of stubbornness, gritting my teeth, and really feeling I was doing the right thing that got me through.
When you get to the point of independence in 1990 in the book, it's obviously a cause for celebration. To some extent, the immediate objective of the newspaper had been met. But I was struck by a passage in the book where you describe standing outside the old SKW building in the centre of Windhoek, I think around the time or just after independence, watching people arrive for a reception which you weren't invited to. And there were the liberators, the leading figures of SWAPO at the time, going into the building, some international figures, and also, some of the people who had been on the opposite side and had played major roles in actually obstructing independence, opposing those who were campaigning for independence, and even themselves, people involved in approving and actually making sure that human rights abuses took place. So, and it reminded me a little bit of the end of George Orwell's Animal Farm, where the revolutionaries who've taken over the farm start to actually change physically and look like the original oppressors who owned the farm. And, obviously one can sense there a little bit of trepidation and disappointment, even in 1990, about what the future might hold. And here we are, 31 years later. I wondered how you felt Namibia has done in general, and where we might have, done well and made progress, but also what have been the low points in terms of those expectations back in 89, 1990?
Yeah, the incident that you actually refer to, Graham, was in fact the Independence Banquet, just the night after Independence Day. And yeah, it was kind of a reality check for me. I went down there because I was curious, of course, to see who was going in with the SWAPO leadership. And of course, it was all those people, even whites from Namibia here, who had sort of opposed a SWAPO in bone and marrow for all those years, who kind of walked together now on the carpet. And it was kind of a reality check, but it also, I think, leads to a time later in my journalistic career, which I think I also examine in the book, where it is that sometimes I had to examine my own feelings at that point and think the piece was called From the Outside Looking In. And I had to try and examine whether I, in fact, was feeling the way I was feeling because I was hurt because I hadn't been invited to the Independence Banquet, or whether it was just kind of a feeling of things to come. And I did come to the conclusion that in actual fact, I wasn't disappointed not to have been invited to the banquet. And I think it leads to the role of the journalist, as the good journalist, I should add, as a fairly solitary figure, that one never really or should get too close to power, and that there's always a little distance. There should be a little bit of distance in order to do one's best work and to be able to really operate independently. So I think it made way for that revelation, if you like. And of course, yes, Namibia, Sam Nujoma did tell me in an interview many years ago that he did want Namibia to be the first success story in Africa, and I think we all acknowledge today that hasn't in fact happened. Clearly, the fact that we got rid of apartheid, that we have a good constitution, that we've had relative peace, except for obviously issues like the Caprivi insurrection, and other incidents since independence, and obviously some anti-human rights attitudes that still persist. But generally speaking, obviously, there has been a huge improvement in a number of areas, but again, also a number of disappointments, that we really haven't exercised those pre-independence sentiments for human rights, equality, and justice to their full potential. Also, that Namibia, as a country which leads the continent at the moment in terms of press freedom, isn't using its muscle on an international stage to agitate for a better deal for journalists and for press freedom on the continent and further afield. So yes, there's always those mixed emotions about what we've done, what we could have done better, and how we can, obviously it's up to the youth going forward, largely speaking, to really change Namibia for the best and make it a really good place to be for the majority of its people. That was always my personal dream, and I'd love to see it happen before my demise, put it that way.
Right. After independence, the Namibian, faced a few difficult issues. Well, perhaps the most difficult being, how to survive economically. And a lot of South African newspapers, publications didn't actually get through that period of the early 90s.
Right.
And then secondly, of course, the other issue, which perhaps wasn't so difficult to deal with, was, that a lot of people, particularly the SWAPO comrades, expected the Namibian to become the SWAPO newspaper, to reflect the ruling party and the government's sort of positions, and to be not so critical. And in fact, the newspaper fairly quickly became quite critical, and I think started exposing various corruption scandals and issues where governments seemed to be wasting money. I mean, I remember the Falcon jet being bought, and the boreholes being drilled on ministers' land and that kind of thing. So I just wondered, on the twin issues, I mean, how did the Namibian actually manage to get through those years economically and actually begin to thrive and do well, certainly by the mid to late 90s? And then also, how did you deal with that independence issue, the independence of the newspaper?
Right. I mean, as you know, Graham, because you were probably with us not long after independence on the Namibian, but those were not easy days. The sort of transition to political independence and to have survived all the threats against the newspaper, to actually witness independence was one thing, but the actual fight for financial sustainability, I think, was far more difficult. And we obviously, going through that transition from donor funding to self-sufficiency was a really tough battle, and many newspapers in Southern Africa didn't survive, but we did. I think it was due to a number of factors. I think, again, a really dedicated complement of staff who understood that certain things had to be put to the side as we tried to become financially viable. Again, there was help from time to time from donors just to get us through. But eventually, I think through lean and mean and not paying huge salaries and things like that, we did make it through, which I think was a huge victory, certainly for independent press in Namibia. And it's ironic that after independence and that survival, and the Namibian doing very well over the years, has again reached another kind of crossroads, if you like, in terms of which traditional media, newspapers the world over, are now really facing a serious battle for survival. So now again, we all have to kind of put shoulders to the wheel and to try and ensure that good journalism, at least, survives and thrives. And I'd like to see it happen in the newspaper context, at least. I mean, I come from an era of what they call hot lead, and the black and white era where we had no color in newspapers. And today, obviously, we're able to do far more. And I would love to see good journalism survive in a written format. And that challenge is really upon us now.
And in terms of the newspaper's independence, I mean, you make clear in the book that was always a key issue to you, not, from 1985 onwards, and you sort of reject the idea that although there were shared aims, the newspaper definitely wasn't representing SWAPO at the time. But how difficult was it to sort of move to a position where the newspaper was critical of, in a way, the more ordinary politics that followed after independence and the ruling party? And was that a straightforward thing, or was it a difficult one to tackle?
I think it was probably difficult emotionally at times, Graham, but just to hark back to the actual founding trust document of the Namibian, where we basically declared that the ethos was for the Namibian to remain an independent newspaper, as it was prior to independence, although, as you've pointed out, there were kind of commonalities, if that's the right word, between our struggle for the implementation of the settlement plan for Namibia, for the chance for Namibians to exercise their own self-determination. And we were in the same viewpoint as SWAPO. We were, of course, also exposing the atrocities happening under the jackboot of apartheid. And that obviously also to a large degree had resonance with the liberation movement. But post-independence, I recall the staff and myself all sitting down and saying, look, where to from now? What are people expecting from us? What do we need to change? What do we need to do differently? And I think the resolve then was clear that the newspaper's role as an independent institution would be to speak truth to power. Whatever government was in the seats of power at the time, we had to hold them to account. The great struggle for Namibia, now having achieved political independence, was economic independence, really, for all its people to enjoy life to the fullest, to have at least the basics. We kept reminding ourselves Namibia is a huge country with a relatively small population, and it really should be possible for everybody to have food on the table, a roof over their heads, and things like that. And I think that is the dream, that is the goal towards which our journalism should be targeted. And so we resolved just to remain independent, and that meant that, yes, almost from the outset, we told the SWAPO government that we wouldn't be holding back. Many thought our job was done. And I remember late Hidipo Hamutenya saying to me when they offered me a post in the first independence cabinet, Gwen, your job is done now. You can relax. You can look forward to a better salary and a decent car. And I remember laughing at Hidipo and saying that I think you're trying to neutralize me, and I really don't want to go into government, into politics. I prefer my role in journalism, and I will continue as I've always done.
At the start of the book, and this is going to be the last question, you feature or mention the famous Margaret Mead quote about how a small group of committed people can change the world. In many ways, I think that has been the story of the Namibian and probably continues to be today, in the way that the newspaper has an impact on Namibian politics and social life, and by revealing things like fish rot and human rights abuses and so on. But obviously times have changed a lot, and these days we have these demagogic political leaders who use disinformation to whip up support amongst large groups of people that can sway election results.
Right.
I just once wondered how much you still believe in the Margaret Mead quotation, and how do you see the future playing out, particularly in terms of Namibian journalism? Are you optimistic about the future in view of all the challenges and difficulties that we are facing at the moment?
Well, Graham, after decades in journalism, I think the one thing that one does learn is you pick up a lot about what I would call the human condition, regardless of who we are, where we are, what tribe we are, what color we are, that there are good and bad people. And I know it sounds very simplistic and naive, but this is why this Margaret Mead quote has always had resonance with me. It's always tough for anybody standing up against a majority and saying this is wrong. We need to do things better. And so I found in that quote, I think, inspiration in my early days of going into journalism and facing all the obstacles I did face, that I thought, if you're going to go out fighting for the right thing. I still believe in that today, and I really do think that people do need to stand up who believe in justice and equality and honesty and all those good things. And equally, I think it applies to journalism. When we look at the business of journalism today, we realize that there are many people who are doing it because it's just a job. For me, it never was that. I've always seen journalism, and I said to someone the other day, as a kind of unelected public service. That's what it's about. You don't go into journalism to make a lot of money. You don't go into journalism to make yourself popular. And often you're a fairly isolated figure if you're doing the right thing and holding truth to power. But I think, on an optimistic note, I think there are enough good young people out there today to make that difference that Margaret Mead refers to, and to bring back, if you like, the power of journalism in the lives of the people. If I think back to the early days of the Namibian, where people were hungry for that newspaper because they wanted the truth about what was happening in their country under apartheid, how do we get it back to those days when people really believed that journalists made a difference, that speaking truth to power made a difference? And today, of course, we have to take on the might of the internet and social media and the disinformation that proliferates to cut through all that crap, if I may use the word, and bring it back to good journalism and the difference that it can and should make in the lives of the people.
What you're saying, of course, reminds me that the book is more than just a history, that it's actually an inspirational book. And certainly that's something that I took from it. I think at quite a few key points in the book, it feels like you've reached the end of the road. There's possibly no way of picking things up and moving on, and yet you do find a way. I mean, particularly obviously in 1984, 85, when you started the Namibian, progressing and actually doing something which has a real impact, makes a real difference in the lives of people. So I just as on a personal note, having worked with you for a number of years, I would urge people to read the book, not just from the historical angle, because it is inspirational and it shows what is needed to make things better in the world. But just lastly, I mean, obviously, hopefully we piqued people's interest and got people to think about getting hold of the book. So how can people actually buy the book, in Namibia, but also, online, if they can order it online and so on? Do you have details on that?
Graham, just generally speaking, I think it's relatively easy to get online through Amazon or other online ordering companies. It's, sad to me in a way. I don't want to read a book online. I prefer to have the physical hard copy in my hands, and I'm sorry that the book isn't more accessible further afield than just South Africa and Namibia right now, but I'm sure that will happen in future because it's very expensive to order a hard copy. So I'm hoping in time that the publishers will make it more easily available over, overseas and so on, where there is also quite a lot of interest. But for now, I think there are a number of obviously bookstores in Windhoek and in South Africa that are stocking it. It's still early days, so I'm sure people will be able to get a copy. And as you say, at the end of the day, I'm just hoping for nothing else other than really, hopefully, that the youth who do read it, and maybe the new edited version of the book makes it a little more accessible to youth who are not perhaps too keen on reading these days, in that they may be inspired in their own lives and in whatever they do to make a change for the better.
Thanks very much, Gwen. And just a reminder to all the listeners that the book is called Comrade Editor. It is available in bookshops and online. So please go out and get it, or search online and you'll easily find Amazon or somewhere else where you can also order it. But thanks very much, Gwen.
Thank you, Graham, because I would like to thank you personally, because you're another person who, whether it's acknowledged or not, is someone who really has always wanted to make a difference and does make a difference in the kind of work that you do. So kudos to you as well, and thank you for being there through many of these years.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Bye for now.
Bye.